Welcome back to another great episode of Dr. J Radio Live. Of course, I'm your host, Dr. J, broadcasting from the city of City of Angels. I was just about to say City of Demons first because it started to become the default of that. Or La La Land, or Hollywood, or any other weird names you guys come up with. I'd love to know them. And we are broadcasting from 107.7 FM UPRN, which is in New Orleans, Louisiana. And this is global, folks. That's right. We are also on Deprogrammed Radio in the United Kingdom, which has terrestrial stations in London and Leeds, and iHeartRadio and wherever else you're listening. But I encourage you folks to go to my YouTube channel because that is where I pay attention to the chat. Now, today we have a super awesome guest. She's written 16 books. That's a lot. And I've read her bio. I hope you all had a chance to check it out. It's going to be a surprising show. So anyway, let me just bring her out and introduce her. Without further ado, Miss Linda Godfrey. Linda, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. The deeply pleasure's all mine. Now, let me back up for a second. Before you started writing books about cryptids and other, what people would call fringe, but we take seriously, what got you into paranormal?
Well, I've always had a sort of an interest in it through my life, and maybe a little bit more open to some of these topics than other people in my newsroom. But I was working alternately as an art teacher. I have a degree in art education, and an artist, and trying to be a cartoonist, and that was what got me my newspaper job. And that led within the first few weeks of my being ordained as a reporter to hear about this strange creature that was roaming around the countryside outside of Elkhorn, Wisconsin. If that sounds rural, it is, but it's in southeastern Wisconsin, so not so far in the boonies. And I remember laughing about it because people were saying there was a werewolf. And I don't know if I'm going too far astray from your question here.
No, this is great. This is exactly what I was kind of hoping you'd go into. Dogman, right?
Pardon?
Dogman.
Dogman, well,
yeah.
We weren't calling it that right away. I didn't know what to call it because I didn't know what it was. But I started interviewing all these people whose names and contacts I had gotten from, get this, our county's animal control officer.
Huh.
Because I was working with him. They were having some problems finding dog mutilations, mutilated dogs buried in plastic bags around the county. And I was kind of interviewing the director about that, and it just occurred to me. I said, "Say, have you heard about this thing people are saying they're seeing out around Bray Road that looks like a wolf or a German Shepherd standing up and walking and running on its hind feet?" And I thought, when I'm talking to him, I'm asking rather timidly because I'm thinking he's going to, give me the hairy eyeball and start laughing or whatever. But instead, he opened up his desk drawer and he pulled out a manila file folder that was amongst all his Regulation County files, and it was labeled werewolf.
Wow.
You
know, and this shows me, actually, I was going to say, now, if we talked about these topics, werewolf, 30, 40 years ago, people would say you watch too many movies or read too many comics. But now, you get more reports of these cryptid creatures. Dogman, werewolf, whatever you want to call it, or anybody out there who's listening wants to call it. We had somebody not too long ago from Louisiana, Dark Waters, who takes these paranormal stories and adds a little bit of I don't want to say fear because that's the wrong word, but he's a good storyteller, but they're all original stories. And he's gotten a lot of reports of this walking dog, essentially a werewolf.
The people all said, I don't know if there was such a thing as a werewolf, but if there was, this would be it. That's what it looked like, and they described the pointy ears on top of its head, the long muzzle and the fangs, which rules out a human being. And most revealingly, they would always say something like, well, it was running or walking on its hind legs very easily, but its legs were bent backwards. And that tells me they're making a real observation, because what they mean by that is they're noticing that it's running on its toe pads, the same as we would be if we were running around kind of tiptoe. And then what would be the heel hitting the floor for us is up on the leg. It's known as the hock, in quadrupedal animals. And so it's running around on its toe pads with the hock pointing back like the heel would do, and that's an actual observation. They're not making that up. It's exactly how the anatomy should be. So I was really struck by all these people, and I must have interviewed, 12 or 14. They didn't all get in the first story, but they were all describing the same thing as far as I could tell. They all seemed completely lucid, completely honest. They weren't dying to tell me about it. They had just done their duty, they thought, by calling the county control officer in case it was a dangerous animal. They weren't looking for fame and fortune. And when I went around and began interviewing them in person, I just didn't feel like they were lying about it. I felt they were honest. Many of them were still very frightened, not so much because they feared they were going to be eaten or, mauled or anything, but because all of them reached this point in looking at this thing they'd encountered when they realized they didn't know what it was, that it was not acting like a normal dog or a normal wolf. And that's when this wave of fear of the unknown kind of took over. And it was just so consistent that I thought, there's something to this, there really is. Even if it's nothing more than a local folktale or fire camp story, it really should be put down so people have something to listen to about it or read about it later. And that was kind of bent of mind I had then.
You mentioned animal mutilations, right, in the beginning. Did you find a link between this werewolf and these animal mutilations? Was it this werewolf that was killing other dogs and other creatures that it may have wanted for food or just for game?
To be honest, I did not. When it was seen eating, it was usually like chewing on a raccoon or some kind of roadkill deer, something like that. The mutilations were not really near Bray Road, which was kind of on the eastern side of Elkhorn. They were more flung out into the various countryside. One was like a whole county away. And the thing was, not too far over the border into Illinois, there was a dog track for racing dogs.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a sad but little-known fact that sometimes when the dogs aren't winning races, they are disposed of.
Euthanized, that's right. I've actually seen dog tracks, and I mean, exactly like that. Just like we have horse tracks here in Los Angeles. I don't know of any dog tracks here in LA, but I remember when I visited my uncle and my cousins in Chicago, in Michigan, in that area. They're plenty. That's people make money on betting on them.
Exactly. And so that was where the control officer was thinking it was going to, was to these ranches, and there were puppy mills and other things going on. So I did not really make a big connection, but it was just one more sort of scary thing to add to that ambience.
Now let me ask you about where do you think this creature came from, because when I think of werewolves, for some reason, Bigfoot also pops in mind. And the reason I say this is because I think of portals. Are these creatures coming in and out of portals to be in our dimension? I mean, where else would they be coming from? Clearly, as you mentioned, the level of detail these witnesses were talking about, things like that is not sort of made up the way it was walking. Just like that famous Bigfoot footage from the 60s, I forget what it's called, something Patterson, I forget the first name of it, but the way it walked on the legs specifically is what really made it struck out from everybody else. And so what do you think about this origin, the creature, the werewolf?
Well, it's still hard to say. I didn't think that, and I still don't think that it's an actual Hollywood-style, old medieval French-style werewolf where you had a man or woman physically changing into and morphing their body from a human shape to a wolf shape,
Yeah.
Happened. I don't believe that's what was happening. I do think there could be some connections to that line of thought when you come to certain Native American tribal beliefs, such as the Navajo skinwalker, where they're supposed to be medicine men who have learned the dark path to be able to change themselves or project the image of a tall wolf over themselves. It's that's debated too. That's one area I personally like to leave alone because nobody really knows except them. But
true.
The portal idea is something that has been coming more and more into favor, and I'll tell you, as we go through generations of cryptozoologists, people who study hidden animals, and people are coming to the ends of their careers. I know the late, great John Keel and several others that I can think of, and they're trying to put an end to all this and figure out what it is. And more are coming to the idea that it seems so likely that they're not here. They have physical bodies, as far as we can tell. They eat, they defecate, they mate, evidently, because they're seen with young ones sometimes, but they're not hurt by bullets. Their footprints will just stop every once in a while, and you won't know where they went. They will be there 1 second and then invisible the next. And you hear these types of observations time and time again, and you think they look normal. They feel just completely real to feel their footprints where they were and to look at them. But then they do something, even just little behavioral things that kind of freak people out, that make them think, no, this isn't normal. This is not a real animal walking on its hind legs, which, by the way, is not a supernatural thing. Any mammal, if its forelimbs are injured or it's trained or motivated otherwise, can walk on the hind legs. It's just that they're not built to do that, and they don't in natural conditions. But when you've got all these other things, and I totally forgot, I'm sorry, what I was going to say.
Well, this is actually, speaking of walking on the hind legs, if you look at the evolution of humanity, of Homo sapiens, going back a few million years ago, weren't we the same way? Weren't we walking on all fours until we eventually started walking on our hind legs?
Well, that's a long and convoluted line that is still being decided by they're finding new
species.
Hominid species very, very often, and I'm not sure that the book is closed on that final thing. But when it comes to, I do have one theory that I call my indigenous Dogman theory in the first book that I wrote on this topic, The Beast of Bray Road, which is that one reason that I think this way is because a great number of hot spots are found in the prairies, the former prairie states, where there once were mostly prairie, Wisconsin and into Iowa and down in Illinois. And it made sense to me that if there were wolves, or maybe wolf-dog hybrids, because the dogs of this continent were imported along with people quite some thousands of years ago, so there could have been dogs around to hybridize with them. If they were trying to wade through deep prairie and these tall prairie grasses, which some can be, 6-7 feet tall, and they're trying to find out if there is eatable, suitable animal on the hoof ahead of them, or somebody that might try and take such a thing away from them, they're trying to see. And so maybe they're getting up on their hind legs to try and see through this prairie, or maybe they find that it's advantageous to hold their prey in their forelimbs, and when they're crossing rivers or something like that. There's all kinds of reasons that it might be a good thing for them, and maybe some of them were born with natural mutations for larger paws, and it was easier for them to stand up and run and do this when they wanted to, and that it's the theory of adaptation. It was beneficial, so more of the offspring that had those big paws could do this, and that's really borne out again in a lot of the witness descriptions, because they'll be talking about the paws, and they'll be saying, especially with the front ones, they were paws, but they looked almost more like hands because they had the long claws, but they were almost more like fingers on these paws. And that's another very, very consistent thing that people will insist the paws were more like hands, but yet they had the long claws, so they knew they weren't human. And the same with the back paws seem to be elongated, and that makes sense too, because it's a lot easier to balance if you've got a little bit more to stand on.
The front paws, if it had fingers, to me that implies the possibility that they're able to grab things the way we hold items. Have you ever heard of anything like that?
Well, it's not quite exactly the same, because it's not just the fingers, you have to have the opposable thumb.
I see. That's right. That's true. That's absolutely true. That makes the biggest difference in all, because when I broke my thumb, the hand was essentially useless, and I don't know why I dismissed that for a second, but you're absolutely right. Yes.
what they can do, and I've had people report this a little bit too, is when they go to grab something, we would open our hand and then kind of squeeze it together with the thumb, and the opposing fingers. What they will do is kind of hook their 4 finger pads over something and then pull, so they still can have a little bit more control and finesse and sort of hold things in a different way than we would with our opposable thumb. The other interesting thing is that they don't, as canines, I'm talking about the run-of-the-mill type. There are other forms, but they're in the minority. But the run-of-the-mill usual ones that people report have the upper body of a canine, which means they have neither shoulder pads or shoulders or rotating elbows and shoulders. So they could not, for instance, pick up a rock and kind of rear back and then pitch it like you'd see a human pitcher doing. That's really something that a primate.
So it would be like essentially a normal canine. Let's just say if you're sitting on a chair and it puts its paws on you or tries to sort of, get essentially vertical. I've even seen dogs do tricks in that way. But you see where their elbows are coming down in sort of that sense. Is that what the image I'm sort of starting to get in my head?
Yeah. It's, picture your dog sitting there begging for a treat in the usual sitting position, and that's how they are when they're sitting. Although they seem to have, maybe it's the larger back paws that make it able to do this, but people will sometimes report that they're sort of in a kneeling or a crouching position, which they shouldn't really be able to do. It's just, if you look at how a dog's bones are put together, that's not what they're meant to do, but yet people report this over and over. So it may be that there are adaptations in the backbone or in the legs too, or that they're just kind of holding them in a different way than we're used to. So there are these things, but other than that, if one was just walking along, you might think, boy, that's a really kind of weird, big-looking dog, but you wouldn't say, oh, that must be a werewolf walking on all fours, because they still have their tails, they're covered with fur almost every single time. In fact, there was a recent TV show that concluded they must be a bear with mange, which would mean they would have to be pretty much denuded of their fur, and nobody reports these things that way, unfortunately. So much for that theory. But they have, and people say they could see, saliva dripping from the fangs and very, very canine features. So But if you want to get into what scares people, I think this is what I was going to mention before. There's one thing that so many people mention, and especially in the first ones, they almost to a person said it. And these were people that, didn't really know what the other ones were saying. But they would say, it looked at me. Very often it would be caught in the headlights of a car or right nearby, and it would have eye shine, where the light is shining up with this little membrane called the tapetum lucidum in the back of the eye, that when you see an animal at night and you shine a flashlight at it and its eyes glare, that's what it's doing. It's reflecting from this little membrane. They would see that, but they said it would be looking right into my eyes as if we were having a stare down. And I would get this feeling that it was trying to convey a message to me, not in the King's English, or in recognizable words, but I would get the picture that it was going to, and these are various comments that people would say, either that it was saying it could jump up on my car if it wanted to, that it could follow me and get me if I told anybody about it, that it was better than I am, a superior being, things like that. Now, how often do you run into any kind of animal in the wild? So, my husband has been out deer hunting and had a bear walk by him, and not once did he say, I thought that bear was mentally telling me that it could come and get me, or that it was better than, it sounds ludicrous in any other animal. So right away, and even people who encounter wolves, there are wolves around, they're coming back to the Midwest in larger numbers, or coyotes. You just don't have that reaction when you know it's a normal animal.
And canines in general, they can sense your fear. It's like they could smell that pheromone coming out too. So I would think that even adds to it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they can smell how we're feeling, literally, in a lot of ways. Their sense of smell, and all those large carnivores, bears, I think it's like 40,000 times the sense of smell that we have, they experience a whole different universe through their nostrils than we could ever even imagine. They know things that we couldn't know. I've read in studies on wolf books that in packs of wolves, they can smell another wolf and tell what part of the kill it ate last time, and then that helps to establish its status. If it had the heart, then they know that they have to sort of lie low next to it. So, yeah, that's another whole thing. But people realize that they're not experiencing something normal when they feel this thing is trying to give them a message, an intimidating message. That's maybe what links all of these things. The message is never, well, you're pretty, or, gosh, that's a nice car. It's something intimidating. And that tells me it's really likely, because it's not attacking them. It's trying to get them to be scared and then probably to move away. It makes me think that they're more territorial than predatory when it comes to their relations with human beings.
Especially if there's not a large number of attacks or people who have actually been attacked and reported it. Unless there have been, and yet people have been scared. But still, I would think if people have been attacked, then there would be some case that maybe people might even been killed. Then that would show that they would actually be predators. But in this case, as you're talking, like maybe they are just territorial. They don't want you coming onto their area. And where you have one, you got to have more than one. Clearly, as you mentioned, the mating, you see younger ones. Same thing with Bigfoot and other creatures. I find it hard to believe that there's ever only one creature. There has to be more. I mean, how could it live and survive? I mean, was it dropped off from a spaceship, or is it extraterrestrial, or did it come from a portal? But usually I would think there would be families and definitely civilizations of these. Now, let me ask you about another creature that I was asking you before we came on the show a couple hours ago, actually, or an hour and a half ago when I was first speaking to you. And we were talking about American monsters, and I was asking you about Champ, Lake Champlain. What can you talk about Champ?
Yeah, it's, and again, this isn't my complete specialty, but yeah, it's upper part of New York State, and it's part of the Great Lakes are really an amazing set of water features, for lack of a better word, in that there's just really nothing much like them anywhere else in the world, and it's easier for me to believe that there is such a thing as a lake monster or a large unknown creature. If it's in a body of water like that not only is large enough in itself on Lake Champlain, but can feed into the Great Lakes, and you can imagine something getting around in that sort of thing. So.
Well, here's another thing that's actually, huge in science, is the fact that we've been able to discover that there is life at the bottom of the oceans that has no sunlight, that's living off the heat from the fissures of the planet. And so if that's the case, I would definitely think that Champ or even Loch Ness may very well, not have to pop up as often as you would think, say, mammals like a whale would have to do. I mean, it's very possible that, their whole civilizations or brothers and sisters, whatever you want to call them, are at the bottom of this lake.
Right. And I think that as you go around the lakes and the oceans of the world, I really believe, since so much, it's some huge percentage figure that has not been explored, and especially on the bottoms, that there almost undoubtedly have to be channels between them that we're not aware of, but that these things can get through, and that probably have learned to stay away from humans. Wisconsin actually has a lot of very large, deep freshwater lakes with big springs. There's one at Geneva Lake, just over the Illinois border, which a lot of people know is a big, happy tourist place. And back in the 1900s and up to the 1930s, there were sightings in that lake of a very similar to Champ-style lake monster. And it was seen by many people. There were busloads of people they didn't have buses exactly then, but cartloads or whatever they used. People coming up from Chicago to look for the lake monster. There was a well-known local minister who swore in his Bible that he had been out and saw it up close. They would see it, and there'd be young men waiting around in rowboats to row out and see if they could find it. And in at least one instance, they were chased all the way back to shore by this creature, and it sort of lingered. And it's interesting because this lake was highly sacred by Native Americans. There were ancient, sacred, animal-shaped effigy mounds all around it. When the settlers came, it was believed to be the spot where the top thunderbird and the lake panther, or the water spirit, there were several different names for it, waged epic battles to balance the sky world and the water world. So it had a lot of long-time significance to Native American tribal people. And then there have been strange things happening on it ever since. But the water creature, whatever it was, didn't stop coming up to occasionally be seen at the surface and swimming around until the motorboat was invented, and then you have these things buzzing all over the lake. You can hardly get on that lake on a summer day now. And so you can imagine what's going to stay around with something like that. But there were fresh springs at the bottom of the lake, and still are, which tell me maybe that it had a place to escape to of lower water caverns located down farther into the earth.
And maybe connecting, right? I think that's definitely a possibility, yeah.
That's what I'm saying. And I'm not the only one to think of that. I've seen, people who are far more sophisticated in geology lay that argument out much, much better than I can. But to me, that's what makes sense. There were so many people who saw that one, and so many people who have seen them in other lakes, small lakes, Loch Ness, and even in oceanic waters when you get close, the eastern seaboard. When people started really coming and settling that in the 1700s, there were lots of sightings of these great sea creatures that didn't stop until more and more boats came, and then they were probably prevented from their favorite feeding grounds and had to adapt and perhaps just go deep.
Let me ask you about this, and if you don't know about this topic, that's okay. I've never really found very many people to know about this, but I've been asked if anyone that I can find a guest that can possibly talk about mermaids. I know of this, I don't even know the name of the person, but there's this billionaire in Hawaii when I was there, and he founded this company where they essentially use the waves to power these robots, and they have these thousands and thousands of robots that are all over Earth, scouring the oceans, and he claims, the billionaire, again, incognito, that the reason they're out there is to get the singing or voices or sounds of whales, but in reality, what he's looking for is proof of mermaids. And I was like, wow, really? I just never even thought that a possibility. Sure, I've seen YouTube videos, but, they're always CGI or something like that. But I've never actually heard of someone putting real money into the effort of finding mermaids.
Yeah, that would seem to me to be a little difficult, but there have been kind of folk legends of half fish, half woman, and sometimes half man people going way back. There was one took place in the Netherlands, which has the North Sea surrounding it, and there are tributaries, there are canals, there are all sorts of ways to get around, and that happened to be the scene, going all the way back to 1403. Villagers pulled in this real strange-looking human. It turned out to be a beached mermaid, and she was covered in seaweed, so she looked a little weird, and she couldn't speak, but they took her in, and she became a Christian, somehow vowed to the Christian faith, even though she didn't have a language that they could really speak with her, and she died after 15 years, and she was supposedly buried in the church graveyard, which was holy ground. So you have these kinds of, these types of stories are repeated and repeated, and sometimes change a little bit here and there, but you just start to wonder after a while if they really were based on something. Was there this woman, with legs fused together and scales on at least part of her body, not able to speak the human language, found in water, seaweed upon her, if there wasn't really something to that?
I know the Japanese, going back to the early 1800s, many claim, I'm not talking for those people listening about this supposed extraterrestrial that came in a ship, but in lore, Japanese lore, they definitely believed that there was a mermaid that was beached and they had to nurse her so she can go back. And the sightings that, if people search for it, goes back to, about 1810, 1820, that era, so about 200 years ago. So if we went to that, what you're talking about, 1403, then we flash forward to 200 years to 1800s, and then we flash to now. If this lore is being kept alive for this long, it's either, what are the possibilities, whether is everybody making something up, or are people really seeing something? Because for us to claim we know that of all the life that is on this planet is really kind of selfish and is wrong. We absolutely are still finding new species all the time, whether it be deep in the Amazon jungles, especially in the waters. I know space, they say, is the final frontier, but we do need to focus a lot more on getting to the bottom of the ocean. I don't think we have a single submarine or anything that can reach the bottom of the deepest oceans right now without them being crushed from the pressure.
Yeah, it's a real challenge. And, really some of these sightings are even more recent. There was one off an island in the South Atlantic in the early 1920s, and another one near Cape Horn of Africa, who was discovered in the mid-30s. Another one near Yemen. These are really far flung around the globe. In 1973. So if these are recorded, I'm sure there are other ones that aren't recorded. There are people like to blame it on sea cows, or manatees, and they'll say, well, what they saw was just a sea cow kind of resting, maybe feeding her child. But it's really hard to imagine. If you look at what a sea cow looks like, it's hard to imagine that someone would take a sea cow covered with seaweed for a mermaid.
Yeah, I don't know how you could even relate the two, because a sea cow, where would people even come up with that? When I'm thinking cow, I'm thinking of the classic Midwest cow, the Oreo cookie sort of spotted cow. To see something like that in the ocean, I don't know, what the origins would be. But that's one thing I definitely would like to see more, is research on the bottom of the oceans, because even megalon, I think it's megalon sharks is the proper pronunciation. Some people even say that they survived the classic 65 million years ago meteor that destroyed the dinosaurs. Because if it destroyed everything that was living on the surface of Earth, meaning the lands, well, who's to say that things that lived on the bottom of the oceans were affected? They might still be alive to this day. I wouldn't be surprised if, when we finally are able to explore the deepest parts of, say, the Indian Ocean or Pacific Ocean, that we are able to find species that go back millions and millions of years that have evolved somewhat, but at the same way, in some sort of weird way, are still related and may even look to what their predecessors were 65, 70, 100 million years ago.
Well, it's especially tantalizing when you realize, this is kind of bringing us along into a slightly different subject, but there are so many sightings of underwater UFO-type vehicles being either descending into water or shooting up out of water, of different sizes and shapes, and it just makes you wonder if there isn't something down there, a civilization. Maybe some of these different-looking creatures are related to the builders of whatever is receiving and sending out these discs or more regular-looking UFOs. It's just, and I've heard this from military people who had experience with it. There was a man that I was interviewing for the newspaper. It was just a kind of a boring small town story about how he ran the airport for this little resort on Delavan Lake, and telling me about some of his adventures over the years. Well, when he got done, I said, "Okay, we're done with the interview. Now, can you tell me?" Because he had confided that he was in the Navy in Puerto Rico. I think it was Puerto Rico. I'll have to double check that later. But he was assigned to a base there, and they had big guns that were outfitted with cameras. And he said every so often something would come shooting out of the ocean. They would have it on the cameras. They could follow it and see it. They would take pictures, and then within hours sometimes someone would come around and collect everything that the camera had taken in terms of pictures. And he said another one of his jobs, he was appointed to ride around with a reparations person, and this reparation person had to go to where mysterious things had destroyed farmers' livestock or crops, and then pay them restoration for what they had lost. And he said one of these things that he went to, and he had top clearance at the time, and he was kind of getting elderly, so I imagine he wasn't too worried about telling me these things. But he said they were driving out to this guy's farm, and they could see him even from a distance. He was just hopping mad. And they pulled up, and he had several cows inside a wooden corral, and something had landed like halfway onto that inside of that corral. And he said where it landed, outside the circle, there was half a cow with its open end kind of seared shut. And then inside that circle, there was no cow. There was nothing. There was another, perhaps mostly incinerated cow. And the man had basically lost his several cows.
His livestock, yeah.
Yeah, just the shock of seeing this place where something had obviously landed that was circular in nature, not like any of their craft that they had at that time, or probably even this time, and that it had incinerated the cow where it touched and landed down, and then left the other half of the cow. The sight of it just shocked him so much.
Now, let me ask you, okay, about USOs. I know Preston Dennett, one of the biggest UFO researchers that focuses on USOs, is known as the worldwide expert on USOs. And I've come to realize that USOs are essentially just UFOs, but once they enter the water, they become USOs. They seem to have a gravitational field around them because they're able to travel at such speeds that make it almost impossible. Even if we were to fire, say, from a submarine a torpedo, the speed of the torpedo, because of the resistance of water, definitely slows it down. But these objects seem to traverse the water without creating nearly as much waves, and are able to go faster than anything else that we know of. Now, here in California, in Los Angeles specifically, just in the harbor between Los Angeles and the Catalina Island, there are so many USO incidents. I'm sure many people that have heard of these famous 911 recordings from Malibu. Several residents talk about, in one case, approximately 200 ships coming from the USO or from the ocean and just flying up into space. And different sizes, discs, like you mentioned, triangles, spheres, rectangles, things that I've never even considered to be able to fly. And yet these are coming from the ocean. Now, Linda, have you ever heard or have seen this, which is found recently actually, is what seems to be an entrance in Malibu? Basically, it's an underwater entrance, and the question is it natural, or is it made by another species? And if so, where does it lead to? And of course, everyone wants to go explore there, but it's deep enough to where you can't go scuba diving, and you would definitely need some sort of funding. But that doesn't mean the military is probably wouldn't know what it is or isn't going in and out of it. But I would love to see if any things or USOs are going in and out of that. And John Lear also talks about a submarine base in Nevada and how Nevada is actually connected with the Pacific Ocean, that California has these channels, as we were talking earlier, that literally connect to lakes, Lake Mead, for instance, to the Pacific Ocean. And when you start to, imagine that, my imagination just really just goes that much further to exploring and to the possibilities of what can possibly be there. Have you ever seen that famous? I mean, it's only been photographed. I've only known of one photograph of what the Malibu so-called entrance. I don't know what another way to describe it or to search for it. But have you seen what I'm talking about on the internet or anything like that?
Not the entrance. There's something else that I've seen, but I did want to mention real quickly when you were talking about what was powering these things or driving them. Something I forgot to mention about my interview with that pilot, retired Navy pilot, was that he said sometimes they'd see these discs come out and they'd have them zoomed in on the gun cameras, and there would be sort of porthole style windows on the craft, and they would see heads inside there looking back at them as they were watching that. So it seems like there was some sort of humanoid type being. And when you talk about UFOs along Malibu, I can't help but think of the Battle of Los Angeles.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. That's one of my favorite cases, and it's amazing how the LA Times photographed in this with the spotlights on it, and yet the Army dismisses it as wartime jitters. Well, hold on a second. Then what is the cover of LA Times showing? Clearly the spotlight is only showing one area, but it seems to be, when you really look at the picture, the spotlight is showing the tip of what seems to be a huge triangle. And allegedly, through this Battle of Los Angeles, there was more than one crash, more than one that was shot down and that landed. One, I believe, in the Pacific Ocean, one in the San Bernardino Mountains, and I don't know if there was a third one or not, but those are the two that are still circulating today. I know Ancient Aliens on the second season, it might have even been the first, I believe it was the second season, did a special, and they had one of the witnesses. He was a young boy at the time, and he remembers the sirens going off, the 1,200 shells, people dying from heart attacks or things like that. But there was definitely things in the sky that were silent, that were there, and seemed to not be affected by our weapons.
Right, and I have one question that seems to me so obvious, and I've never seen anyone answer it anywhere. How is it that in an incident that lasted for hours, where millions of people were affected by having to have their power cut, turn off their lights, get herded into little shelters so they couldn't see anything, but yet all of these beach towns around Malibu and around that coast had cameras installed on the beaches, because they'd all had this scare with this, Russian submarine not too long before that, and everybody was kind of ramped up. They'd brought in pairs of rockets for every one of the towns and had them on railroad cars. Why is it that there is only one photograph of the whole thing? 1,200 rounds of ordnance that was shot, all these people. You can't tell this. I mean, this is Hollywood. People had cameras at that time. They had to have had cameras in the early 40s. They weren't like our cameras, but there had to be some. They were all over the beaches. That more photos were taken. Where are they?
And video. I would really think that video, because sure, we had the studios.
Think there have to be some of those action films. Where are they? Why is there only one photo? And it's that one famous photo where the searchlights are converging, and you can there's sort of a void. If you look at it really closely, there's sort of a void where those and how there must be something there, because the searchlights wouldn't all be trained on it, but yet you can't see it.
And that's Robert Morningstar, a good friend of mine who lives in New York, is the one that had me look at that photo really deeply and told me where to see the shape of the rectangle. But you're absolutely right about the void. It's blocking out the skies behind it or above it, and something was there again. Like you said, all these cameras. I'm sure the military came around and confiscated them, but why were they allowed to release that one of LA Times? If they immediately said the next day, oh, it was just because everyone had the wartime jitters, why were they allowed to have this one, which to this day, people say, look, I don't care what the stories say that it was wartime jitters. We've have photographic evidence that was it can't be photoshopped. CGI wasn't available in 1942, I believe was the year, and yet there it is on the cover of LA Times.
Yeah, and how is it the only one? It can't. It's like they chose what they said. Well, okay, we got to give them something because they did see something. So which is the least revealing? Maybe it's this one, and they took all the others and put them away. But they had tracer fire, I'm sure, that would have bounced, and I think there is something to this for reasons I can't go into here, but there should have been other photos showing tracer fire and all kinds of things.
Lighting it up, right? Especially the tracers lighting it up. I would think so.
Yeah, and lighting it up and then bouncing off if there's something to bounce it off of. But in places where you would think it should be, showing that it went right through. Well, I'm getting incoherent here, trying to make my little brain think of all this stuff. But there have to be more. When you think of millions of people, it's Hollywood. It's not the Stone Age.
Yeah.
There are somewhere other photos, but why is it we have only one? It's not, it's just incomprehensible.
It's not logical, that's for damn sure. It's really not logical. And I would hope one day through the Freedom of Information Act or something that we can get more photos or possibly video, as we mentioned earlier, because this was Hollywood and I'm sure some studios are located by the ocean all the time. You always have television series and movies, even in the 30s and 40s, that featured the Pacific Ocean. Regardless, I would think even though the civilians and the studios had cameras, but so did the military, as you mentioned. You mentioned the Russian sub. I know for sure that they were worried about a Japanese submarine because of something that happened near Santa Barbara a few days before, but that was completely different, unrelated. That was not in the sky, and that was not more than one object, too.
Yeah, that's what I meant to say was Japanese. I'm sorry. Didn't mean to interrupt you either.
No, it's the same thing. It's still a submarine is what we were worried about, and we had the whole coast, not just California, going up to, I would think to Oregon. I mean, that we were definitely worried from an invasion, especially after Pearl Harbor. And so you have military cameras, you have civilian cameras, you have the studio cameras, and yet, like you said, we only have one. And the witness testimony is what really makes it for me.
There's a great book with a lot of it in that, and photographs that I don't have at my hand right now. But here's the other factor that mitigates it being just something like a rubber or a weather balloon that showed for just a minute or something like that. It was going slowly. It was not zipping along. Usually you think of flying saucers, as they called them, or craft of any type. UFO crafts, they're zooming, or they'll pick up and just go zoom over the night sky. This thing was moving slowly, by all accounts, all along that LA seaboard as it went, all along the beach, all along these beach towns. It was going slowly so that everyone could get a good look at it, that it could be fired upon, and it wasn't like a zipping thing where they had this excuse like, oh, well, it just went so fast we couldn't get it, on our cameras. Everybody had plenty of time to take pictures. If there were old films being taken of it, they had plenty of time to get its movement and other things that were in the area. And like you said, the Japanese sub, thanks for correcting that, by the way, yes, had everybody kind of loaded for bear. So it wasn't that they were unprepared either. They should have been ready, set, go to take any photos that was coming along. And they did. They had to have, because our military is very smart. They're not slow people.
No. And, I was speaking to a Navy SEAL who was a SEAL during the Vietnam War, and the way he explained that civilian technology, well, first of all, we all know that the defense budget is the biggest that we have, right, in America at least. And so all the research and development always goes to the military before it trickles down to us. So whatever we have, you would think the special forces, and this is what the Navy SEAL was telling me, is about a decade or so ahead of what we have now. So 10 years ago or 20 years ago, before we started using smartphones, this is where the capability of, say, any special forces. So all across the coast of California at the time, obviously we had Coronado Island in San Diego, and I don't know if they were able to see the craft all the way down there, but regardless, it's not to say that you didn't have SEALs and other, there was bases all around. Right here, as a matter of fact, where I live, there was a base that was closed in the 80s that was opened in the 30s, after World War One, and there was another one in downtown that was not quite downtown. That was actually closer to I want to say Long Beach, but not really. But it was not too far from the ocean because you can get the breeze. And so there you had all the aircraft, you had the jeeps, you had the arms, that they were using, they were firing, and the soldiers that they were all ready to go at at a moment's notice. Because again, this is after Pearl Harbor. Now let me ask you about. Let's talk about for people, because I know people are enjoying this, is the fact that the people died from the ordnance that were fired and the shells that came down and actually hurt people. I know there was, I believe, at least one car that was hit by falling shells, the debris, because we didn't hit anything that, that unless, except for those two that I mentioned. Other people mentioned that there was one of the crashes in the ocean, and another one was in San Bernardino Mountains. But for the most part, all 1,200 rounds that were shot just sort of like reflected off this. And we're talking about huge rounds, surface to air rounds. We're not talking little 45 caliber bullets that you would shoot, in a whatever it be in a pistol. You're shooting at something in the sky to take down an aircraft. And as you mentioned, it was slow.
A shield.
Yeah.
It had a shield.
Exactly. And I wonder if that same shield is almost, and this is going back to the USOs, if that same gravitational shield that's able to propel it underwater and to make it resistant to, or to not be, the USOs to not be affected by the water, is the same sort of force field that protected these, and during the Battle of LA, these, whatever you want to call them, triangles or just aircraft. Because, as you mentioned, they're first of all slow moving, they're silent, and anything that we knew of at the time that was slow moving then would have been an air balloon. Well, you're telling me that one shot of any kind going up there wouldn't take down an air balloon? It just doesn't make any sense.
It would have just blasted it to smithereens. Well, and what you were saying about the car being hit by the shell and that kind of thing, almost everything that I've read that's a recount of it, the people were told that the cars crashed into each other because they had their headlights turned off because of the no light ordinance that was posted. They weren't supposed to have any headlights, but they were trying to drive anyway, and so they crashed into each other, which, I don't know about you, but it just sounds a little bit strange to me. I mean, there must have been light cast off at least by that amount of fireworks going on in the sky. It could have been completely dead black and silent. But don't you think that sounds a little suspect too?
Oh, absolutely. And when you do look at the one and only photograph, is you do see light around the rounds being fired in the sky. Even though I don't know if those are tracers or not, I don't know if they are, but you still see, them illuminating that area. It's not just the spotlight. And you also see the darkness below, which is what the story was. Everyone had to turn off their lights, I guess, I don't know, herded into shelters and all that. It's just a really strange, bizarre case, and I wonder why it happened in 42, and that was 77 years ago at this point. Why haven't we seen anything like that since anywhere in the Pacific Ocean? I
Mhm.
mean, I'm talking about on the coast, at least of California, where you had something where the military was attacking it in front of everybody in the population of Los Angeles or population of San Diego or whatever it be at the time. That's the only known case that I know of where we were shooting at something so openly. And it wasn't secret in that sense, except what happened the next day when they, took back the story. And then I'm assuming, like we talked about the photographs, they probably took them all and classified them and all that. There's a lot more to that, and that's why it's a sad point that the witnesses, because of age, are dying off. There's not very many people left that were alive that remembered it. And the people that are still alive were really young. It just goes,
Right.
77 years ago is obviously a long time. So if you have a 12-year-old, then he would have been 89. Just anyhow, that's one of the most amazing cases to me. I have this book, and it's 1900 to 2000. It's the LA Times front cover. It's the most famous of them. I mean, it's got the Titanic. It has when, World War II, when the Japanese surrendered. And it actually has this Battle of LA. I was blown away that LA Times, when they went through all their covers, decided to select this one. It's like, okay, we're going to slip this into here. And,
Mhm.
even though we're not supposed to, even though we were told it was wartime jitters, let's just put it in this book. And I was just amazed to actually find it because I didn't have to do much digging. It's just right there because it's in chronological order, but it doesn't include everything. I mean, if you have 365 days, you're going to have 365 different covers. No, no, no. They picked like a handful for each year. And so that was really interesting of the 1942 to find that in that book. And so that was one thing that I actually showed to my family because I never heard of the Battle of Los Angeles. They weren't here at the time. They came from another
It was
country.
it was the same photo, though, right?
It was the exact same photo that we're talking about, the one and only, Los Angeles Times photo.
So
Yeah, the one where it's illuminating the spotlight on it.
impossible. It's just impossible for that to be the only photo of such a ginormous event. And especially when everything was trained at the sky. It's just I just can't believe people were expected to believe it, and yet everybody did. It's like the Men in Black movies where, did somebody run around with one of those little porta cameras and flash everybody's faces so they forgot what happened? And,
Yeah.
that's what it makes me think of. I don't know. I just don't know how you could get that down to one photo. And, and I guess in wartime people don't like to speak up. They don't want to, be the ones sticking their head up above the rock. And maybe just everybody thought that but kept silent. But I'm willing to bet that there are somewhere contraband other photos, because people are also resourceful, and so are, again, members of our military. There must have been somebody who kept one or had something else or passed it to a civilian, or a civilian who had a camera roll that he managed to hide or something like that, wouldn't you?
Absolutely, and we do know this, that in every army regiment, or every military regiment for that fact, they do have a journalist to document, especially in that era, so they could show their superiors. So they would develop the film, whether it be a video or just photographic, and they would bring it to the War Department and make decisions. The point is definitely embedded in those troops that were shooting at the sky. There were military photographers on top of the civilian photographers. Now, while we're on the topic of UFOs, you wrote a book on UFOs, right?
No, not exactly. I've included them, stories of them, and I did for Barnes and Noble in their Weird series, in the Weird
Oh,
U.S. story.
is it just in the Weird Michigan? Is that where I'm getting it from? Where you had
Weird
UFOs in?
Michigan and Weird Wisconsin. I have various UFO stories, but none of them are that big or far-reaching, as the battle for Los Angeles. But I do have documents, and it's sort of it actually was my great interest long before I ever heard of wolfmen. But because my dad had been followed, he grew up in northern Wisconsin, where actually there are lots of UFOs, very close to the Great Lakes up there. And he saw some type of light following a pickup truck. He was riding home with some people in the back bed of a pickup truck, and this light was following him. And he always had this interest in UFOs, and he got all those, like Galaxy magazine and different accounts of UFOs that were around the house. So, and I was the type of kid that would read the back of the cereal box for fun, So of course I was reading all those, and I did have that interest from before. But I haven't written a book just on that topic. I did, however, in my last couple of books, the one that's coming out in July and the one that came out before that, I have some interesting UFO stories, which involve one of them involves my grandmother.
Ooh. And this is also in Wisconsin, right?
Well, this was partly in Wisconsin, but it actually happened partly in Germany. And I found it because I've been interested in, there's also a connection between werewolves associated with different military installations, and it's true in the U.S., Germany, and the Netherlands, and so I've looked into things like that. Well, there was a woman named, I'll just call her Hilda, that's not her name, but I'll call her that, and the main war had wound down. It was, after VE Day in
Europe.
So that was like 1945. And here's my grandmother in rural Wisconsin with a 5th grade education, although she kind of schooled herself, and she was much smarter than that. But she somehow, through, I think it was through my uncle, who was stationed as a mechanic in Germany at that time, and he had this man make friends with him, and somehow my grandmother ended up with a pen pal who was highly educated, who had worked at one of the German island military installations, and she started writing letters to my grandmother. And my grandmother, this was a very old-fashioned German family that did not associate with any sort of outliers, relatives, or non-relatives is what I meant to say. And she somehow gets this, the only lady friend I ever knew of that my grandmother had in her whole life. The rest was just family, family, family. And this lady, Hilda, started writing to my grandmother and asking her, I think she was trying to get help to get to the United States. And she wrote my grandmother a letter, though, that asked her if she believed in UFOs. And she said, well, we now know what they are. And she drew these little pictures, and they looked like the little Die Glocke.
Yes,
bell.
the bell. Yes.
That's what it's like. And she went on to explain to my 5th grade education grandmother that everybody knew how it worked now, and the propulsion was in the rim that sticks out kind of at the bottom where the bell flares out, that the propulsion was in that. And I'm thinking, what am I? Then she had little diagrams of them. This will be in my next book. And so that's something I've been contemplating. I also came across my other grandmother lived very near her in west central Wisconsin. And I was there interviewing people for a video my son and I are making about this huge influx of both black and tan mountain lions in this little area between my two grandmothers' homes, a 20-mile radius of Hillsborough. And there was this farmer who is maybe approaching 90 years old now. And back in, I think it was 42, he was out in the field with his father, and his father said, look, and pointed up in the sky, and there were these two, he called them flying fence posts because they didn't have another word for them. They didn't know what they were. They were these two cylindrical kind of they might have looked almost like the cigar shape, but not quite. And they were white or gleaming white, and they passed very slowly overhead. They were horizontal, and then all of a sudden they stopped in midair, completely aligned at all times. And this was broad daylight, by the way, and right over their heads. And they turned to a vertical position, and then they headed straight to this very tall rise known as Wildcat Mountain. And his father rushed into town to the newspaper office, only to meet a neighboring farmer who was also rushing into the newspaper office to report this thing. And nobody ever found out what they were, but they were headed for this big mountain-like thing that still exists today. In fact, the name of our movie is Return to Wildcat Mountain, because they're all coming back. And more than half of them are black, which aren't supposed to exist, by the way. But anyway, so I had this other report. And also, another weird thing that was happening in the years following that, and up till fairly recently, is that there have been all these very weird, unexplained airplane crashes on that same route over Hillsborough. And it's not an airplane route at all. And, I go through all of those.
Do you think that they're actually colliding with something that they possibly can't see, or maybe something is, a UFO is maybe getting in their way, or maybe something is affecting their navigation that is bringing them in that direction?
Yeah, I would say something like that. And it's interesting because geologically, very nearby is what's called the Baraboo Rise or the Baraboo Hills. And it's this huge, I think it's like 20 miles long stretch of a ridge of earth that is made up largely of this very rare pink quartzite. I think there are a couple of different shades. One is rhyolite, I think. But you know what quartz is? It's used for radios and all sorts of things because it has unique properties. And I've thought, and I think in almost every case, they were coming from that area to the east of Hillsborough, and had passed this huge reserve of quartzite before this happened. So, in my mind, that sounds like some sort of a connection. I couldn't prove it scientifically, but it seems too frequently reported to ignore that.
Well, I've known from people who have either been abducted or had contact, or other people who were formerly in the military. There's something, the properties of quartz that I don't know if it's being mined by these extraterrestrials, or maybe it's only found on our planet and nowhere else in our solar system. I can't really tell you. I don't know about geology to that level, but I do know that there is some connection, whether it be in the craft or whether it just be something that they want. I don't really know, but I do know that quartz always comes up. That's the one metal one material that we have on this planet that seems to be relative to UFOs.
Right. No, I totally agree. So, so I've had a little inordinate interest in UFOs, I would say, over the years. You know how hard it is to find answers to that sort of thing.
Yeah, especially after World War II, because I would think that everybody, if they saw something and they reported it to, at the time, it was before we had the Air Force, the Army, like Roswell, Army Airfield, right? The Army Air Force, whatever they called it. The point is people were patriots. People, if they were told to shut up, they did. But the mistrust of government over the last 70 odd years has come to the point where people would see something and now they're going to talk about it. And that's why you find a lot of books, you find every major television or cable network has shows on this, whether it be History Channel,
right.
National Geographic, Discovery, Travel Channel, Destination America. They all have shows regarding UFOs, and especially, as I mentioned earlier, ancient aliens. This goes
Mhm.
back thousands and thousands of years. So, what are the odds? Is everyone making something up, or is everyone seeing something? Well, in reality, people are really seeing something, and something that's unknown to us, something that clearly doesn't seem to originate from us, unless it comes from the bottom of the oceans. But even then, they go to the skies and then just disappear. Some say they disappear into other dimensions, like they blink out. I've seen videos of that, and witnesses talk about that. Others just see them take off, and to the point that you can't see them anymore, till they shrink because they get so far up into our atmosphere that they're gone. So
Right.
that right there is the stories are very consistent there. Now let me ask you. I mean to ask you about this. You've written, I believe, on the is it the Beast of Bray Road?
Right. That was the creature that we were talking about originally. The first one, I named it that because I didn't think it was a werewolf, and because Beast went better with Bray Road than anything else. I liked the way it sounded, and it didn't commit the thing into being any one particular um, sort of unknown creature. So yeah, that's what that was all about. And you had mentioned Dogman too earlier, and that actually came into play fairly quickly. I had, for one thing, adopted that name, the indigenous Dogman, with my little theory about the paws getting, just accidentally selecting for larger paws, and then they could stand up. Well, within a week or so after it hit the newspapers and went out on AP, I received a call from a man who was a disc jockey in Michigan, and he said, "We have that same thing. We have the exact same thing. We call it the Dogman." And he said, "There's a legend about it," and he admitted that he made up half of this song that he wrote about it, and then performed and sold CDs to make money for the local animal shelter. At least that was his story. And they called it the Dogman because that was the legendary name in Michigan. And it made me realize that these things were universal. It wasn't just one little family on this lonely road outside of Elkhorn, Wisconsin. I started getting letters from all over the U.S. Of course, there were radio stations and TV stations from everywhere. And in fact, actually, Travel Channel did a really good story. It appeared, I think it's episode 8 now in this season's In Search of Monsters show on Travel Channel, and that's a real good one to look at if you want to get some idea of how that whole story evolved and happened. But it was just like we let it out of the gate, and it just kept going. And like I said, I worked for that newspaper for 10 years, writing stories on almost everything else. I think I wrote like 3 or 4 update stories in that time. That was it. And then I really wanted to just do some other things and left the paper and started writing books. So that was how that whole thing got started. But when I wrote that first book on the Beast of Bray Road, my motivation was just to put everything out there that had happened so people would have a record, and then they'd be satisfied. Well, of course, what happened was that everybody else who hadn't seen the first one started writing me too. It just began another onslaught. And then, so I wrote Hunting the American Werewolf, and then a third one had to come, and they just have evolved into all these other things. So
Well, as I mentioned earlier, in Louisiana, there was Dogman reported there. A lot of people say they've seen it by swamps, according to this one friend I have, James, who also goes by Dark Waters, talks about that. And like
I
you
know him.
said, you do know him, okay? And it's all over, like you said, America, and even globally. He even mentioned that it's talked about in other
Yep.
countries.
Yep, Canada, South America, France, Germany, parts of Italy, Virgin Islands. I mean, I've had contacts from all over, and sometimes there are slight variations, but overall they follow that same pattern. So, it's still what I would say I'm best known for is bringing that particular cryptid out into the open and maybe making it better known among, well, just around everywhere.
Let
Globally.
me ask you this too. When you were working at the newspapers before you started writing the 16 books, which is fantastic, and it really made you established. That's for darn sure, and all your television appearances as well. But when you were working at the newspaper for those 10 years, what other cryptid creatures did people report?
Immediately, and I'm talking, like within days of the first paper coming out, it was Bigfoot. And I realized there was a good Bigfoot population that went back at least 30 years that I could document, and had hints that probably more. And people would call me and they'd say, I haven't seen an upright Dogman, but I've seen Bigfoot. And I was mapping it out on an area map, and I could see where they had sort of mapped out their own territories. For instance, the Southern Kettle Moraine Park, State Forest, just to the east of it, if there were any sightings, they were almost always Dogman. And then inside the state forest itself, they were almost all Bigfoot. And then heading west of it, they were mostly Bigfoot with a few Dogmen. So for some reason, the Bigfoot were holding. And that actually, the Kettle Moraine State Forest is where I've had my own sightings and incidents that happened, and they were all with Bigfoot, although it's ironic because what I would want them to be would be, of course, the Dogman, which is what I'm more known for.
How many did you have sightings?
Of what?
The Bigfoot.
But personally, myself, I had an incident to start with in 2012. I had to wait, mind you, 20 years before this happened, just going on faith and thinking maybe someday I'll see one, where I won't go into the whole thing. If you want to see pictures, you can go to lindagodfrey.com and into the information or search box type Bigfoot branch, because I was maybe 100 feet away from a tree, a very live, healthy, big oak tree, and stood there as something I couldn't see. It was hidden in the leaves because it was, again, as I said, living, very leafy, very green. In 2 snaps, and this was a quiet August day, no storms or anything like that, nobody else around. In 2 snaps, in a twist, it tore this 8-inch diameter, 35-foot long branch of the oak tree off. Jeez. And dropped it 40 feet down into the kettle. And,
that's some strength, seriously. Yeah. Humans can't do that.
No, they couldn't possibly. And in fact, I came back later with some friends to inspect it. I, of course, wasn't going to go down there. I knew when it hit the ground, I knew there was nothing else that could have done that. And I was wondering if maybe it was old wood, or there had been woodpeckers at it. And that was one thing I went back to look for. And it was fresh, just fresh, regular branch. There was nothing dead about it, nothing already sawed or woodpeckered or anything. So there were also 2 prints where if you were bending over and you wanted to twist something large, you would place one hand in front of the other, and then you'd grab it to get the right torque to twist it first and then snap it off. There were 2 9-inch long, sort of mitten-shaped imprints in the bark where you could see the fingers were separated, and that had just been torn off of that branch. They were in the exact right places where they would have had been, and I've got photographs of those. I still have them. One of the pieces remained intact, and I still have that piece from the bark. So and then I call it my almost sighting, because my friend that came had her 20-year-old Bigfoot not knowledgeable daughter with her, and while her mother and I were looking around measuring the branch and stuff, she actually saw the Bigfoot. And she didn't know that there could be tan and gray ones that are called blonde Bigfoots. That I had several of those reported to me from around that park, so I knew that they could be. And she had no idea, but she saw it, described it perfectly, was quite rattled. We also all smelled it, and it growled. And there was nothing else that could have done any of those things. So that was my first one. And then over the course of the year in 2000, 2 years later than that, 2014, I think it would have been, on 3 separate occasions in some adjoining fields where there were just every bit here and there was a kettle. A kettle is a deeply scooped out area of earth that the glacier, the last glacier that came through, scooped, just like you're scooping ice cream out of a pan or something. That's kind of what they look like. They're deep, and they're full of glacial till, which is loose pebbles and things, so it's hard to get down in them. And they're full of all kinds of animals and plants that don't grow anywhere else. They're kind of mysterious. So
unique to that area.
Yeah, quite unique, and quite a bit wilder and more inaccessible than people, and larger than people might realize. There's quite a bit of it. And I saw it on 3 different times during that year. Twice I was in a car. Once my husband was driving and refused to stop because the Bucks game was about to start. Another time I was alone in my car, and I slowed up, and by the time I slowed up and backed up, it had left the area, which was impossible for anything else. And this was daylight, and I was that I should have been easily able to tell what it was, and I could. And then the other time I had just taken off for a walk. It wasn't that far from my own neighborhood, and it was just standing in a field. I could see the difference from it and a bear was that it had shoulders, but it was covered with black hair and a round black head, and it was sticking up over these meadow grasses that if I had gone and stood in them, it would have covered my head pretty much. And the thing is, right where it was, I knew why it was there, because there was a nest of sandhill cranes that like to be in that field right at that spot. And he was visiting the nest to see if there were any nestlings or eggs or something like that.
To eat,
exactly,
possibly?
I call it he, but I had the feeling it was a he, but I don't know why. I couldn't prove that. But while I was looking at it, I looked away because at first I was thinking it must be a fence post or something, the round head sticking up there, even though it wasn't really the color. And I looked over at the fence posts, and they were gray and straight and smaller, about much smaller. And I looked back at it, and then when I looked back at it, it was like, oh, she's looking at me, and it slowly lowered itself down into the meadow. And that's when I turned around and got out of there, because it was, like I said, fairly close. It could have gotten me if it had wanted to.
And especially if it had the strength of what you had in the first sighting that you talked about, of the branch that it tore down. That ability, that strength would either rip a human in half, or then do that much more damage. But also, I don't know if I've ever heard of any cases of Bigfoot actually harming people. It has scared people, and I've gotten the impression that it's just like the werewolf we were talking about at the beginning of the show, where they're territorial. Do you get that same impression from witnesses in your own sightings?
Yeah, I do. If there are as many as people claim there are, because there are probably 10 times more Bigfoot sightings than Dogman sightings. But if there are that many around, and if they were out to get us and eat us and maul us, we would be seeing that. We would know that was happening, And occasionally someone will claim that. I've personally never had it reported to me. I've only had one Dogman injury reported to me, and the man it happened to thought that it was an accident. He didn't really blame the creature. So again, it does seem to be either something that's territorial, or this is a little more ominous, but people have asked me this, could it be something that's just being held back? Like they could do these things. They're out there, they're observing us, but they don't. And people have said, well, that just feels like they're like a dog being held at leash or something.
Earlier when you said you got the impression one of them was a he, I've heard from other people that possibly one of the reasons why they're so elusive is because they have the ability to be, or they are telepathic, and therefore I'm wondering if that's the impression it gave you in your mind.
It's possible, and I would impute that more to the Bigfoot than I would to the Dogman, because as much as I focused on Dogman and written about them and talked to so many witnesses, and I mean, I've talked to Bigfoot too, and have probably felt closer to that, but I've never gotten that feeling of a real message. Well, of course, I don't think I've really been close to a Dogman, but I have had dreams where the Bigfoot appears and is talking or communicating or something like that. And I've never had that feeling with a Dogman, even though I may have been close to one at a time in Michigan at one time. But they felt very different, to me.
The vibration that you felt?
Yeah, they didn't seem like they were the same. And I've heard other people say that too. They think that they're different, just different in nature.
Let me ask you this. We talk about Bigfoot, and then in other areas they call it Sasquatch, and then we know in Florida they call it skunk ape, and then there's also mountain yeti. Is it all the same species, or are they different subspecies?
Well, with the Bigfoot, I think that they're the same species, but they're just, in the same way that, some people have yellow hair, some people have black hair, some people have red hair. It's like us. They just are different sizes and shapes, and they're very close to human, in my opinion. And there are people who believe they may be a subspecies of human. I don't think they're just some random primate that came here. I think they're more than that. And with the Dogmen, again, if you look at a wolf pack out in the wild, National Geographic has some really neat specials where they show wolf packs where they're all different. There'll be a couple of alphas that are gray, and then one that's all black, and one that's kind of a scruffy brown, a mixture. Animals of all types vary in their outer characteristics, but they still it's the anatomy and the behavior and how they're put together that determines, well, and the DNR, if you can see it, that helps us know the difference one from another. Wouldn't it be nice to have the DNR?
Yeah, I would. And when you're talking about how they're different, hair color, and also they obviously, I would think over time acclimate to the areas they live, like the mountain yeti. If it's living in, I believe is it the Himalayas is where people talk about it's being seen?
Right. Yes. Mm-hmm.
I would think it would be acclimated to the altitude, the cold weather, and therefore might have more fur and things like that. That would make it different enough than what we find here on this continent, for instance. And like you also mentioned earlier in this show, is the fact that the book is not closed on Homo sapiens. And just recently, this was on mainstream news, One American News Channel, which is one of the newest channels that's trying to compete with CNN and Fox News, etc., talked about these geologists were exploring a cave in the Philippines, and they found remnants of what they believe to be another ancestor to us, that it dates back to about 50,000 years ago. And the scientist that was talking about this, because obviously once these geologists came upon this, they brought anthropologists in, and they ended up saying that this makes the history of us that much more messier, that much more exciting, and obviously so many more possibilities. And therefore, to say that we came from Neanderthal or Cro-Magnon and just that linear fashion instead of branching out into different subspecies, like for instance, as you mentioned, that we are closely related to Bigfoot, that's what it seems more probable than to be something that is just out of the blue or closely related to the ape, especially if it has higher intelligence. And that's one thing that
Right.
I've always paid attention to.
Right. No, I totally agree. And Bigfoot seems to be very intelligent. It doesn't seem to need all the trappings of civilization that we have. It's able to live in the animal world and yet seems to have that human intelligence. And then, of course, I'm a Christian, and so I believe that God had a hand in how we came to be and that we were purposely designed by Him. And I think the wonders of DNA is that it is something, I don't know how any just slapdash accidental thing could bring forth this system where you've got these intricate little genes, things that can be turned on and off, like toggling something on your computer, things that can be moved around a little bit like a checkerboard, and you get something entirely else. It's like humanity and all the things that all the other animals, we're designed to fit in wherever we find ourselves on the planet, and God would have realized that the planet's conditions are not going to be the Garden of Eden in the whole place, because we've always had North and South poles and we've had atmospheres, and that we would have to be different in different places in order to survive. So this is all built into us somehow, and I certainly don't claim to have the answer on how exactly he did it, but to me, all of these things, every time a discovery is made, I just think, wow, it just gets more and more amazing.
Interesting, right? It gets more and more amazing and interesting. That's why when I heard that report of this, 50,000-year-old ancestor of us, which is completely a whole new species that yet it is related to us as opposed to
Right.
related to, a monkey or an ape. That what makes it so much more exciting. And I would think that as time would go on and the deeper we go into caverns and caves, and as I mentioned, we talked about earlier in the ocean, we will find different species on this planet that, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, it'd be selfish for us to say we have all the answers of and know all the species, considering that there's so many being found all the time. I don't know what the last number I've heard about the number of species on this planet, but it is so high when you talk about from bacteria to insects, and even within insects, there's just, you got spiders, you have centipedes, millipedes, then you have mammals. It's just so enormous. Now, let me ask you, before we run out of time, and I want to give you time to also plug in your books and everything like that, is there any other cryptid creatures that you have studied or would like to see more information on out there?
Well, one thing that piqued my interest a few years ago when I wrote American Monsters, and I divided it into things that fly, things that swim, and things that go on dry land. And I thought, well, the bird one's going to be, or the flying one's going to be sort of a short chapter. I wasn't sure what all there was. And I was astounded, really, when you get down to it and start looking, how many flying cryptids that there are. You've got everything from the things that look like giant storks to the things that look like revived pterosaurs to things that look like giant humanoid bats with wings.
That I've actually heard too, and that's really interesting too, especially because I know in Africa they do have giant bats, and if they were just 2 feet taller, then that would be the equivalent of, say, almost like a child, or like a 7-year-old child with wings. And when you think about the fact that they eat are carnivores, then I would think that also the fear that seeing one of these flying above would really scare the heck out of me. Have you, when you heard about these, what region of this planet have you heard about these being seen?
Well, they're over quite a bit. Believe it or not, Wisconsin, the Wisconsin to Chicago corridor has had a lot of sightings over the past year or two, and some of them are believed more real than others. But I had, back in 2006, I heard from a man on the western side of Wisconsin near the very rocky cliffside with Wisconsin River that flows up on, forms our western border of the state. And this was a man in his late 40s and his son in his 20s who were driving home from town. They had kind of a rural residence late at night, and all of a sudden they were driving a pickup truck, and something was coming at them where the wingspan was as wide as or wider than their windshield of their truck.
Jeez.
And they thought for sure it was going to, they're just like, okay, this thing is going to hit us and we're going to die. Just before it hit the windshield, so they got a really good look at it, and they said it looked like a wolf-like head, a human-like body, and these huge wings. It jetted straight upwards, and as it went, it let out this very piercing shriek. And the son, they went a little farther, the thing sailed off where they didn't know, and the son had to pull over. He was physically sick and had to throw up before he could go on. And then the father kind of took ill and was sick for a couple of weeks. And I was there within a few days of it and did a lot of ground investigation. We went and tromped around where they saw it and in the direction where they thought it had gone, and there were some other things. And it was pretty intense, and the men were just completely shaken. They had never imagined anything like it.
You know, when I think of that, it reminds me of the Mothman, and I even see that written by Frankie Zomboy in the chat. That's what that case reminds me of, and it's actually amazing that it's. What year was this that this sighting was had?
That was 2006.
So fairly recently, as opposed to Mothman, which I believe was in the 60s, if I'm not mistaken. But
yeah.
Wow, again, there's just so much more out there, and I would hope that more information comes out. And I would hope that one day maybe we can actually see a book. And because you illustrate all your own books, I think that makes it that much cooler and better. Because when you're able to visualize something as opposed to just something being written, it adds to that much more element to what people are seeing them, all the witnesses. Anyhow, I wanted to tell you, thank you, Linda. It's been a true pleasure having you on the show, and I wanted to give you time to talk about your books, the next book coming out, and where people can find them. And you.
Sure. Yeah, and my books are generally available, especially the last 4, which includes the one coming out in July, at all the online vendors of books. And the one that's coming out is called I Know What I Saw, created by so many people's statements. They say that, I can't tell you how many people have ended their story to me saying, I know what I saw. And then there's a subtitle with that, Modern Day Encounters with Monsters of New Urban Legend and Ancient Lore, where I'm trying to somehow find connections between these creatures and the lore which came first, the creature or the lore. And that's kind of a fascinating thing. It's just getting into this labyrinth that you're never sure you're going to come out of because they seem to match, but then they almost don't. So that's, I think, going to be very interesting. And I have a chapter in there on those Hillsborough, both black and tan cougars returning to that area, and the film that goes along with that chapter, you can just go to on YouTube to return to Wildcat Mountain, and that'll pop up if you want to see that. My most recent book was Monsters Among Us, and again, it's trying to draw associations and find things in common, such as phase of the moon during these sightings, sunspot levels and activity during sightings, that sort of thing. And it gives me a platform to share some of the stranger things that might not have gotten in some of my other books. The same with the new ones. Transformations, for instance, are more heavily emphasized in Monsters Among Us, where I never really felt that I had the platform to present them well. It seemed to work out for that. So you can go to lindagodfrey.com, and there is an About page that has my bio and other things, and a calendar of places that I'm going to be. I'm going to be in mid-July when the new book comes out. I'm going to be at bookstores in downtown Milwaukee, Chicago, and in Madison. This coming weekend on 7th and 8th, I'm going to be in the Twin City of Marinette, Wisconsin, and Menominee, Michigan, up on the border. There's a Bigfoot conference, and we're going to be showing a rough cut of Return to Wildcat Mountain. And you can find just about anything there. There's a box. You can tell me your incident that happened to you if you want, or share something there. Lots of other stuff on that site. I have lots of archives of happenings, and one was just in the past year with reports that many of them aren't in any of the books or elsewhere. So a lot to dig through if you can just get to lindagodfrey.com. No W's, just Godfrey.
Well said, Linda. And again, it's been a true pleasure. And for everybody listening, again, check out her website. And even on my website, there is a website to Linda Godfrey's site. You could click on it directly and it's a hot link. It'll take you right to her site. And if you do have something interesting to report, I definitely recommend reporting it to her because you know what? It might appear in her next book, especially if you are able to describe it in a level of detail where it can be drawn because we have an artist here. That's very rare when it comes to this phenomenon. I think that's fantastic. Also, let me give some shout outs to, I want to thank Pam Vrettenberg, my social media manager, but everybody check out her website, unitedtruthseekers.com. I have all my moderators in the chat. I want to thank you for being in there. As a matter of fact, I want to thank everybody in the chat who's been paying attention and I've been seeing the comments. Clearly, you guys have been very interested in what Linda has to say. And I'm sorry we didn't get to your questions today, but I will definitely bring Linda back so we can cover more of these topics, which I know you guys wanted to touch on more. And we absolutely will. Unfortunately, we ran out of time today. There's just so much I wanted to pick her brain with, and she, of course, she's written 16 books, so there's so much that I'd love to learn. And I always have to say this: is the deeper down the rabbit hole I go, the more questions that I've answered to, or find answers, the more questions become exponential, and that's something that everyone, I'm sure, is finally starting to realize as we start coming to every year that we get more information, there are that many more questions because there's so much strangeness, if that's what you want to call it. I want everyone to also keep an open mind, and remember, the only thing you have to remember about this show is the name of it. That is Dr. J Radio Live, DRJ Radio Live. Everything from Minds, Facebook, Patreon, of course YouTube, LinkedIn, whatever you could think of, it's all the same name. And if you send something on Twitter, that's usually where I do pay attention to more so than email. And with that being said, I want to thank Joe Montaldo, station owner of 107.7 FM, New Orleans, Louisiana, iHeartRadio, and JC, owner of Deprogrammed Radio in the UK. And now I'm going to take off for the night. Will join us tomorrow for UFOs Over America with Preston Dennett. And we're going to go more into USOs tomorrow because, of course, Linda brought it up today, and I think it's a super important topic for us to talk about because most of the surfaces of this planet is covered in water. And when you factor that in of what's really going on, then that's why I say there's always more questions than answers. And now I'm going to officially sign off.